Fox body Mustangs were never known for their handling. They were muscle cars, not sports cars. But many aftermarket companies saw the potential in the Fox platform, and now you can upgrade every single suspension component. Having so many options is awesome, but it also has a downside. It's really easy to get caught up in mod mania, the endless cycle of buying parts because they're better than what's on the car, and therefore you assume your car will be better with those parts installed. For me, deciding on suspension upgrades always comes down to one question. What am I asking the car to do that it can't do? I covered my 1992 GT's previous suspension mods in part 1 of this series. They made a huge improvement in the car's ability to attack the cones. But as I started eliminating braking and entering elements faster, ThoroughbRED began to lose composure and started to push. Even with my adjustable suspension, I was running into the limits of what the car was physically capable of doing. Obviously, weight, brakes, and tires played a role in this issue. The car will be lighter in 2020. It will have better brake pads and much better tires. But that means I'll want to enter corners and change direction even faster than before. If you're looking to improve composure after you've upgraded the hard parts in the suspension, you need to upgrade the parts between those parts. Bushings. This video is all about removing the weak links from my suspension with modern bushings that will help with corner entry and composure during transitions. Like every other aspect of this build, these mods are minimally invasive, relatively inexpensive, and can easily be undone. The primary focus will be the front suspension bushings. Global West Del-A-lum bushings have been on the market for years, and I've always wanted to try them. They use Delrin bushing material and an aluminum shell to create a bushing that functions like a bearing. And they move the A-arms forward just over 1/4 of an inch to create more caster. More caster improves straight line stability and corner entry. These bushings don't bind, and they're greasable. They're a big step up from the Prothane poly bushings I had on the car. As you can see, there's no gap between the Del-A-lum bushings and the K-member. OEM rubber and aftermarket poly bushings leave space between the bushing face and the K-member. That space is slop in the front suspension, and it's costing you composure out on course. And that's costing you time. The combination of fit and function provided by the Global West bushings should make for more precise steering inputs and more consistent feedback from the front end. Global West also makes these Delrin steering rack bushings. Steering rack bushings are often overlooked when people start autocrossing their Mustangs. It doesn't take long for old rubber rack bushings to fail when faced with high-speed slaloms and sweepers. My 1992 GT has poly steering rack bushings. I use aluminum steering rack bushings in my 2000 GT, and I want to see how the Global West Delrin rack bushings stack up. They should improve steering feel by eliminating deflection in the rack. Steeda makes these Delrin sway bar bushings for 1 3/8 inch sway bars using Steeda aluminum sway bar mounts. If you look at the poly bushings that came out of the car compared to a new set of poly bushings, you can see they're warped and torn. Fighting the weight of that big 5-liter during quick changes of direction puts a lot of stress on your sway bar bushings. No matter how good the mount is, poly is going to deflect. I use the Steeda Delrin bushings on my 2000 GT, and the difference is pretty amazing. They allow your front sway bar to operate at its full potential. But, as I discovered, they don't work with the 25-year-old Steeda sway bar on my Fox body. Steeda redesigned their front 1 3/8 inch sway bar at some point to improve its performance. As you can see, the bends are different, and there are flanges welded on to mate up against the bushings. There's no point going back to my old setup because it clearly wasn't optimized, so I'm installing a new Steeda front sway bar to be able to get the benefits of using Delrin bushings. The Global West Del-A-lum A-arm bushings, Delrin steering rack bushings, and the Steeda Delrin sway bar bushings should all work together to improve steering response, eliminate nervous handling characteristics, and allow you to get the most out of your suspension adjustments. Just as important as upgrading your suspension components is checking them periodically to make sure they're in good working order. I checked my tie rods prior to running the car in 2016, and they were fine. But when I tested them after tearing the car down to install the bushings, I found this. That tie rod would not survive long under autocross conditions. I took this opportunity to change all the inner and outer tie rods on the car, and I checked my steering rack for leaks. The front fenders sit closer to the tires on my 1992 GT than on my other cars. I wanted to add a little more space between the fenders and tires to allow for more body roll than before. Steeda makes these steel spacers that go between the top of the spring and the spring perch. They raise the body of the car half an inch. The spacers will allow me to use the softest setting on my adjustable struts if I ever need to, adding more options for suspension adjustments. My poly lower front spring isolators were torn up. These were brand new in 2016. I was able to replace them with another set I had in the attic. It's a good idea to inspect your isolators every time you rotate the tires on an autocross car. The debate about the best solid rear axle suspension upgrades will rage on until the end of time. You're probably sick of me singing the praises of the Steeda adjustable rear sway bar, but it's the best bang for the buck option out there. It's been a couple of years since I've autocrossed with this setup, and I'm curious to see how well it can do against competition in 2020. But there's one part of the rear suspension that needs upgrading. Spherical bushings have become very popular in recent years. I'm replacing the two-piece poly bushings on top of the differential with this J&M spherical upper axle bushing kit. Spherical bushings allow for much more articulation than rubber or poly bushings, and they eliminate deflection. They offer smoother operation, and they don't bind. They should help move the limit of traction further out, which means I can be more aggressive on course. While working on the rear end, I discovered the rubber bushings on my rear shocks had deteriorated. The Takiko Alumina 5-way adjustable shocks have been discontinued, but I was lucky enough to find a new old stock set online. There's no way those old bushings would have survived autocrossing. It's always good to check every piece of rubber on your car, especially if it's been sitting for a while. You might be surprised to hear that those are all the suspension mods I'm making to ThoroughbRED. The car did well with the suspension it had despite the weak links, so I'm hoping that eliminating those weak links will help me stay competitive against cars with many more suspension mods. Most importantly, I want to be able to prove whether or not these relatively inexpensive upgrades can actually lower my times out on course. The Global West Del-A-lum A-arm bushings cost $160. The Global West steering rack bushings cost $21. The Steeda Delrin sway bar bushings cost $80. The Steeda spring spacers cost $9. And the J&M upper axle bushing kit costs $80. That's a total of $350. If these parts do what they're supposed to, they'll be worth every penny. I'm going to put them to the test and post my reviews after the 2020 season starts. I mentioned earlier that these mods will allow me to get the most out of my suspension adjustments. I meet a lot of people with similar setups that aren't sure how to dial in their cars. So part 4 of this series will cover how your adjustable suspension parts can be used to address understeer, oversteer, and get as much grip as possible when you're racing around the cones. I'll post my initial thoughts and install tips for these suspension parts in another video.